Okay. So for tonight, after this, next week we have Pesach. Again, for those who are interested, Monday night and Tuesday night. Monday night either on Zoom or in Yeshiva University, and Tuesday night in Fifth Avenue Synagogue. So this is our last Bava Metzia shir until after Yom
Pesach.
Tov, and then we'll pick up with a lot of these.
We'll pick up that Tuesday right after Yantif, right, Rabbi? There's no.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, good on Zoom.
Again, how did the Yom Tov work out?
They work out that Sunday
It
is
ends on
it's over.
Sunday.
Oh,
So so
okay.
so we're good. So I just want to double check.
Okay. Anyways, so yeah. So what I want to talk about tonight, we've been discussing the din of Reb Chia, or it's known as Reb Chia Kemaisa. Let's just go back to the Gemara for a minute, and we discussed Moda B'Miktas and the two ways to read the Gemara. I want to talk a little more about Reb Chia and his Chiddush tonight, and then if we have chance, we'll continue through the Shaklavitaria and Gimel Beis. So again, getting to Reb Chia, back to Reb Chia, you have this in the sheets on page 1. Tani Reb Chia. It's also, if you have a Gemara, it's on Gimel and Aleph towards the bottom. The Gemara says, Tani Reb Chia, Mana li biadecha. Ruvain says to Shimon, you owe me $100. V'hala Omer, and the other fellow responds, Shimon, and says, Ein lecha biyadi klum. I don't owe you anything. That's called kofar hakol. He denies it all. The ha'edim and the witnesses, they're me'idim also sheyesh lo chamishim zuz. The witnesses say, we know for sure that he owes part of the alleged, obligation, but as for the rest, they don't know one way or another. Okay, so they confirm miktsas hataina, and they're mechayev mamon. They trigger chiv mamon, an monetary obligation on that part because witnesses are unsurpassed. They are the gold standard, right? Their testimony, all things being equal, is always accepted. So in this case, again, Ruvain said, you owe me 100. Shimon said, I don't owe you anything. The Edom said, you owe 50. So there's going to be a payment of 50. But the Chiddush of that part is not a Chiddush. Everybody agrees about that. Reb Chia's innovation is that just like Moda B'Miktsas, when the person admits part, right, that creates a spillover obligation to take an oath on the rest. So too, if there's a chiyuv mamon b'miktsas al yedei edim, that's the equivalent of chiyuv mamon b'miktsas al yedei hoda'ah meaning an admission, and therefore in both cases is a chiyuv shvua on the rest. That's Reb Chia's big chiddush. No sin lo chamishim zuz v'yishava al hashar, and the reasoning is shalotei hodas piv gedola mehadas edim mikal v'chomer. We're going to test that kal v'chomer from Gimel base to Dalet Aleph. They're going to test that Kal V'chomer. The idea behind the Kal V'chomer is what is a more formidable source of information? I mean, what do you rely on more? Testimony of two witnesses or the personal admission of the Baldavar? The answer, mostly is that the testimony of two witnesses, I said before, is the gold standard. We believe that to be truth, all things being equal, unless there's some sort of an internal, struggle between different adim, or what's called a din maruma, where like the dayanim get whiff that there's something not kosher, going on in this testimony. The dayanim are given a certain amount of latitude in halachic law.
And they put aside the Ados Baldin Kamei Edom as not being.
So Hodas Baldin Kamei also has its limitations. And we'll discuss that more going forward. But for example, one of the issues is, what happens when Hodas Baldin Kamedim is contradicted by witnesses? And especially if there is some sort of a kula attached, a leniency attached to this admission.
The
Sometimes.
Baldin is only when it is against his interests, so to speak.
Yeah, right. But in the real world, Even if something is against one's interest, there can always be impact on other people, right? And the question is that that's exactly the point. Is
Well,
it fair to impose
Like
the
when there's a lien or
repercussions?
something, a third party lien or something of that nature.
Yeah, exactly. So even if it's clear that this is detrimental to the moda, and that's Hodas Badim command, that's why we accept it, right? As I say, there could be unintended or intended
Consequences.
in some cases consequences that affect other people. That's why when the Gemara says in Kiddushin, on Daf Samach Heyamid Beis, the Gemara thought, like, why do you need witnesses for a marriage? The Gemara says, maybe I'm a Kaddish B'fnei Eid Echad, Choshin the Kiddushin. Maybe even if there's only one witness, we should worry about it because it did take place. The event took place. So the Gemara says,
But
no,
but
no.
but
Yeah.
those Edom are not the same kind of Edom. Those Edom are part of the actual
Well, that's maybe the answer
organization.
of the Gemara. You're
Yeah.
getting ahead of yourself, but right. So the Gemara says, why don't we just believe them, the Chassan and the Kala, if they both say we're married? Why don't we believe them? Literally, that's what the Gemara. So Hodas Baldin Kamedim Dami. So the Gemara answers, the answer is because
There are
Ishus
offsetting issues.
is Chav Lachrini. Chav Lachrini means it has ramifications and some negative consequences for third parties. The way Rashi interprets, I don't want to get into that whole topic right now. Rashi says, for example, the relatives of the chassan and the kala are affected by the marriage. Right. So it's not just between the two of them and they say we're married, we commit, to behave as if we're married. The result also is that now, these relatives have been dragged into the process. And on the say so, just of the admission of the chassan and kala. So, if you want to believe them about themselves, that's fine, but it's also chav lachrini. Now, again, I also happen to
By
think that what?
the way, not getting off the subject, but if the witnesses are relatives, for example, they can't be witnesses. But
Right.
if they, but yet if they impact other people that they may be relatives to, they're still good witnesses, right? In other words, if I come and one of the witnesses of that two people got married, okay,
Yeah.
but that impacts
Well,
somebody
it
else.
depends how directly or indirectly. That wouldn't be a psul kurva, but it might be a psul nogea b'davar.
Uh-huh.
So, but it depends on the level of impact and involvement.
Because otherwise, it ain't a double shasaf. I mean, it's
Yeah,
impossible for
exactly.
anybody to be a
Yeah,
witness.
yeah, exactly. So that's why you have to figure out, how you know, how distant the impact really is. But that's the principle of Chav Lachrini, is the principle that Hadas Baldin only works, or at least primarily begins to work only when people are speaking about themselves and in a detrimental, legal fashion. Anyways, getting back to it. So the normally we think Hadas Edom is superior to Hodas Piv, because Hodas Edom, goes in both directions, not just what's detrimental for the Bali Dinim, right? So since that's the case, so the Gemara is saying just like Hodas, just like Moda B'Miktsas, which is Hoda, has a spillover effect of Chiyav Shua, who adin, the same thing is true for Hadas Edom. That's from Chiyav's Kiddush. And later on in the Hamid Aleph, the Gemara quotes, we discuss this, right? I'm just reviewing for a minute. Avua de Rab Apturiki, who disagrees. And then there's some question on whether we paskin like Reb Chia. We don't paskin like Reb Chia. Most people think we do paskin like Reb Chia. The Rambam thinks that we paskin like Reb Chia, but he kind of blames it on the Gaonim.
Even though he's a yachid?
Who? Reb
Uh,
Chia? So yeah, it's not the person who argues with him is also it's Avua Darabi Aptariki. So it's not it's not clear who has the majority on his side. Most of the people think, again, there are some exceptions, but most people are of the opinion that we pascha like Reb Chia. What we discussed last time was the whole principle, the next line of the Gemara. If you skip a little bit, the Gemara says, "Mikav shelo tomar hodas pivu de Rami Rachman shvu aleika de Rabba, Domarabba mepnei ma'am retorah modin mixas satayna yishava chazaka ina domeis pana b'fnei bal chovo." So that line, that's what we discussed last time, which is there are two ways to read that Gemara. It's a very rare Gemara where the Gemara says, where one of the authorities in the Gemara says, "What's the reason for a did doraisa?" Right? Mipnei ma omra Torah. Why did the Torah say? Usually we don't ask that question. Anyways, this Gemara appears in at least 5 places in Shas. You can see on the side of the Gemara. And there are two opposite interpretations, very rare, about what it means. Just to review for a second, because this will get us where we need to be. So the Rimi Gash in Masachet Shavuos and the Rashi in Bava Kama, Daf Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph, read the Gemara as questioning, how come only motive and miktsas is chayiv v'shvua? Why not also kofar hakol? And the answer is chazaka elu lemeis pana b'fnei bal chova. Because, meaning, there's an admission here, which is very important, and that is, in theory, even though there's no corroboration, because there's no miktsas hoda'ah or miktsas chiyuv avedim, it's a taina bialma, just a claim, and a denied claim at that. Nonetheless, there would be a basis for a chiyuv shvua, except there's always a patur, there's always an exemption. What's the exemption? That people are not going to brazenly deny absolutely any obligation that they have. So if somebody's kofar hakol, the likely psychological indication is that they are at least partially telling the truth.
In the category of an overwhelming rove?
An overwhelming?
Rove. We have a concept of overwhelming rove. In other words,
rogue?
Rove.
Oh, rogue.
Yeah.
This fellow's like an overwhelming rogue.
Then he may be also. Right. In other words, what's the underlying?
It's a chazaka. Yeah, this is a rove. We call it chazaka in meis but we don't mean chazaka here in the sense of like a status quo ante. We mean it in the sense of a rove. But it's what's known as a ruba de lesa kaman. Meaning it's there are 2 types of roves. There's a rove in the room and there's a rove, in the general probability table. So, if you have, 5 pieces of, kosher meat, on the table, and 1 not kosher meat. So on the table, you have a rove. It's called ruba de isa kaman, a majority, a probability or a majority that is present. But sometimes many roves are what we call ruba de lesa kaman. They're part of like a bigger, population. Right. So let's say you have only one object, let's say in the world, or let's say in New York City, or in, whatever block you happen to be in. Let's say rove of the meat is kosher, right? And miut, only a minority is not kosher, right? So that is, but you only have 1 piece of meat in front of you, right? So you don't have that majority staring you in the face, like in the case where it was all on the same table.
It would be a probability factor.
So the answer is it's a broader probability, but that's a rove. That's called ruba de lesa kaman, which I don't want to get into this now because it's very far afield, but these are really interesting issues, obviously. But what the relationship is between ruba de isa kaman and ruba de lesa kaman, meaning is one more or less effective than the other, or are they equal? So this is a two days in Rashi and Chulin and other indicators, back and forth. Like, are they equal or is one better than the other? Which one's better than the other? Like, it's clear what the problem is. In the case of ruba de isa kaman, you have the probability, you can rely on it because it's in the room. Just because something is a broad probability doesn't mean the probability that you're encountering on that object isn't just an exception. So ruba de isa kaman is stronger in one sense. On the other hand, ruba de lesa kaman is stronger because if you look at it from the miut standpoint, the exception is staring you in the face in a ruba de isa kaman, because the 1 treifa thing is sitting on your table too. But in a ruba de lesa kaman, which means it's also a miuta de lesa kaman, for all we know, we can ignore the miut. Maybe you can't ignore it if it's sitting and staring at you, even if you don't know which one it is. Anyways, I don't want to get into more of this, but these are, the chazaka in the part of Bachovo is a kind of a rubit de lesa, come on, even though the phrase chazaka is used, it's a little bit misleading. It doesn't mean like, a chazaka in the sense of mukzakus. It means a rove. But in the end of the day, um, that's how Rashi and the Rivigash read the Gemara. However, the way the Bali Tosas read the Gemara all over Shas and most of the Chachmei Sfarad, and also Rashi in most places, in Bava Metzia, for example, in our Sugya, just not in Bava Kama, is that the Gemara never asked the question, why is Kofar HaKol not Chayiv? The Gemara asked the question, why is Moda B'Miktsas yes Chayiv? It should be Patur Migu Di Bai Toain Kofar HaKol. Right? Since he could claim Kofar HaKol, we should believe him when he says he's Moda B'Miktsas. That's what a Migu is. Unless, and the assumption is that just as Migu works in Dinei Mamadis, it works in Shavua as well. Migu lafture mishvua amrinan, that's the assumption. That assumption is actually denied emphatically by the Rimigash in Shavuos. Rimigash in Shavuos says, Migu lafture mishvua lo amrinan. That is not true. And therefore, that's one of the reasons that he has to read the Gemara in the opposite way. Anyway, that's where we are. What I want to do today is I want to talk about, so then the Gemara continues. We turn here to the Amud base. The Gemara, then continues on its discussion about Hodos Baldin Kamedim Dami. But before we get to that, I'll read a little bit. So the Gemara says as follows. This is on Gimel Amud base. Go down 6 lines. Yeah. The Gemara says, "Umay kal v'chomer." Everybody with me?
Yeah. Ma piv shein.
So ma piv shein mechayvo mamon mechayvo shvua. Edim shemechayvin also mamon and edin shemechayvin also shvua. So the Gemara says the kal v'chomer is that piv, meaning a person's admission, his odas baldin, is not mechayiv mamon, and yet in Moda B'Miktsas it triggers a chiyuv shvua on the rest. He admits 30 of the 100, he has to take a shvua on the other 70. So Edim shemechayvin also mamon, Edim who have the ability to impose a chiyuv mamon, Einodin shemechayvin also shvua. That certainly triggers a chiyuv shvua. That's the kal v'chomer, meaning Edim are more powerful than Hodas Piv. If Hodas Piv is Mechayiv Shvua, then Edus is Mechayiv Shvua as well. Except the Gemara says that what we just attempted to demonstrate is not so simple. What do we say? That Edom are Mechayiv Mamon and that Piv is not Mechayiv Mamon. But isn't that against the rule of Hodas Balin Kamedim Dami? So that's the next line of the Gemara. The Gemara says, "Vaha." After all, Hodas Baldin is Kameya Edim Dami. It's not true that Edim alone is Mechayiv Mamon, right? The person who admits that he owes whatever it is that he admits, he has to pay it. So if somebody comes, let's say Reuven says to Shimon, "You owe me $100." Let's say Shimon says, "You're right, I do. I owe the $100," and there's no witnesses. Okay, Shimon is obligated to pay because he admitted it, which is the reason that he's obligated. Let's say he says, "I only owe $50." He's obligated to pay the 50. Why does he have to pay the 50? Because he admitted it. So that's That's what the Gemara is asking. What are you talking about? That piv is not mechayiv mamon. V'ha, after all, hodas baldin is kemeya edim dami. It's like 100 witnesses. So we'll get back to this.
But on the other side, a piv is not mechayev in an isser because you can't make yourself into a Russia.
Well, I mean, mostly that is true. We'll see in a moment.
How
You
can
can make
mechayev himself a shvua?
you're talking about the principle of Einon Mesim Atzma Rasha.
Right.
That principle applies. You'll see Bali Tosas actually discussed that here in Tosas, the end of Tosas. You see on the bottom of the page, there's a Tosas Ma'im Yirtzeh Lomar Mezele. You see?
Right. Yeah.
So if you go in that Tosis, if you go, where is it in a second? Yeah, if you go 2 lines up, Tosis says, Vim Tomar, Heich Neman Lomer Mezera Yisi, Ha'ino de Mesa Matzma Russia. That's the principle that you were just invoking. What Tosis answers is, Yishlomer de Neman Lif Salatzmo, Aval Hacha Osa Tshuva, Ve'ena Rotza Lavi Chulin Lazara. It's very tricky, Tosis. It appears in a bunch of places. Tosis says like this. Normally, well, I'll say the way the Ramban says it first. Normally, Einan Ames Matzma Russia is in the area of Psul Edus. Like if I come to court and I say I committed a crime, and that like the kind of crime that disqualifies me for being a witness. So the Gemara says, Ein Adam Mesa Matzma Russia. You cannot be the, you can't self-incriminate, right? And to formally lose
credibility,
your cheskes kashrus. However, says Tosas, what happens in a situation where I say I did a certain crime, right? And I want to do tshuva, right? Or I did a certain crime, and the reason I'm admitting it is because if I don't admit it, I'm going to end up doing another Aveira. So, example, the continuation of the Gemara here is as follows. The Gemara says, let's say somebody ate chalev, or there was a dispute whether he ate chalev. Chalev is chayev, malchus, or korban, whatever. So the guy says, let's say he's being accused, achalta chalev, right? And he, to aid him, they say, or ra'inu also sh'achal chalev, right? So let's say he responds by saying, in nachanami achalti, but achalti b'mezid v'lo b'shogeg. I ate it intentionally, not accidentally.
So shouldn't have to bring a korban.
Now, on the one hand, that's worse because if I say I ate it accidentally, I'm not calling myself I'm not labeling myself a Russia. I made a mistake, right? So why would I ever say, it's not true that I ate it b'shogeg, I ate it b'mezid? Why would I ever say that? Well,
doesn't want to bring a korban.
True.
They want to save money.
What?
You want to save money. Doesn't want to bring.
The answer is because a korban. You don't bring a korban on achilas chalev b'mezid intentionally, only b'shogeg. So here we have a very interesting situation. Again, we're a little off the. We'll get back on track in a second, but since you asked, so it's a very interesting situation where, on the one hand, I'm intensifying my wickedness by saying lo achalti shogeg el amazid. I did it intentionally. It makes me worse. Now I'm a Russia. Right? Now the effect of being a Russia, if you believe me, is I shouldn't bring a korban. So the Gemara said that's what Tosa is saying. Don't believe him because ain't a mesa matzma Russia. Tosa assuming that even outside the area of Eidus, it's not just that, to formalize a psul Eidus, you can't do that through self-incrimination. You need objective evidence. No, this is a little bit of a different. We're not talking about being puzzle Eidus here. We're talking about whether we demand a korban from him, or we believe him that he doesn't need a korban because he did it in a manner that was far worse, and therefore there's no kapara. So that's what Tosa says, but this is a very important idea, is v'yeshlamar de'ein neman lif salatzmo, aval hacha osa tshuva, de'ein arotzi lahavi chulin lazara. Meaning, what are you going to say? We don't believe you that you did it b'mezid? He's screaming, I did it b'mezid. You're going to force me? It's not that, bringing a korban has no downside. If you bring a korban chatas and you know that you are not supposed to, it's not a voluntary korban. So that you're violating the prohibition of being mevi chulin lazara. It's not a real korban, it's a korban on false pretenses.
Which is correct.
That's what I'm trying, in many cases, in all legal systems, but this is particularly true for the halacha because it's so vast and complicated,
And
as we've
Pullman
seen
by
many
Zora
times.
has a
What looks
punishment
like a
place,
chumrah
no?
isn't always just a chumrah, you know.
Pullman by Zora
It's some chumras are maybe l'day kula and some kulas are maybe l'day chumrah. So this is a
Pullman
great
by
example
Zora,
of it. He says, I did it. The guy says, you did a terrible thing. You ate chalev, the shogeg. You have to bring a korban. And the guy said, worse. You don't even know the half of it. I ate it b'mezid, right? So he's making himself, into a real
Isn't
rush.
this between him and God? I'm confusing monetary and personal. I'm
Say that one more
confused.
time.
I mean, what he eats, why is that anyone's concern besides him and God?
Well, Ramban says something close to what you're saying, even though I'm not sure if you're fully appreciating what you're saying. But the Ramban does say he's explaining a different halacha. The halacha is when it comes to a korban chatas, we say ein mimashkinan. You don't force the guy to bring the korban. So mostly the Rashi and Balitosis say, how come you don't force somebody to bring a korban chatas? We coerce people to do certain mitzvahs.
Yeah, but
So they
the whole
explain,
idea of carbon is that you
wait,
want kapara. If you're
yeah,
not smart enough to want kapara, tough
uh,
luck.
uh, 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 excellent. So the Rashi and Tosis in different places, in Bava Kama, Daf Mem Vav, and so on, say because it's a din of kapara.
well, we force kapara.
One second. Wait,
That's
wait,
what
wait, wait, wait,
Malchus
wait,
is
wait,
all
one sec,
about.
1 second. Let me explain the two views. So Rashi and Tosis say it's a din in kapara. So he's going to bring it anyway. You don't have to be mamash. You don't have to force him. It's in his best interest. But the Ramban, in a bunch of places, including here in Bab Metzia on the staff, and in his Perish al Torah and in Masachet Makos, there's one which isn't consistent. That's in Bava Kama Memvav. But the other places, the Ramban says, Jacob, what you said, which is not because we think he'll bring it anyway because it's in his best interest. Even if we know he for sure won't bring it, it's between him. The Rebbeinu Shalom gave him an opportunity of kapara. He doesn't want to take it. That's his problem. Why should we force him to get kapara against his will, right?
Yeah,
Well,
100%.
no, we don't
Well,
say
yeah,
That's
that.
what the Ramban said. By the way, not everybody agrees with the
We
Ramban.
don't
Now,
say that by Malchus.
hold on, Andy. Why? I mean, saying you're arguing someone we should force kapara. I don't hear the other side.
well, no, because there is a chiyuv to bring a korban. It's not a he's obligated to bring a korban. The only question is, are we going to coerce him or not?
But Malchus is also kapara, and we force
What?
him.
No,
Malchus,
that's different. Come on, Andy. A carbon you bring for forgiveness. Malchus you do because you got to beat the guy up. You can,
no, Malchus is kapara
maybe
also.
jail's
There is the
kapara.
effect. Malchus is a punishment, but there's the effect of
Yeah, but you can't
kapara.
compare Malchus to carbon or
The
jail.
Gemara says, "V'nikla chicha li'enecha." Once he's nikla, once he gets malchus, then he's a chicha again. So you're right, there is kapara for malchus. But the reason for malchus isn't kapara. The result of malchus is kapara. By the way, we talked about this, but one of the reasons that there was a movement in the 16th century to bring back smicha, rabbinic ordination, because there were people who said, "Oh, we need malchus for kapara purposes." So you're not so far off, but it's still different than a korban. The point is, but either way, Jacob,
Kulin
your point,
Bazora is chayev koris.
what?
Kulin Bazora is chayev koris.
Chulin Bazara is, I believe, Balav.
Just a love.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
But either way, what Jacob, your point is true, according to the Ramban, about Eina Mashkina and Korban. But it's not relevant to what we're discussing here, meaning what we're discussing here is the fellow said, I ate Chela, but I ate it b'mezid. So Tosus is saying, right? You shouldn't believe him because we don't believe people when they incriminate themselves, right? And Tosus is assuming this is where others
Whoa,
already.
one second. There's a difference when you incriminate yourself on a financial basis that we don't believe you. But if you incriminate yourself between you and God, why is that anyone's business? I'm totally
Well, no,
confused.
because there's also a consequence here, and that is that we see you as a Russia. We might be post cellular ADOS and things like that.
Oh, you're saying the outcome because then we'll make you pasul Ada, so we can't believe
Yeah,
you.
but exactly. So, but what
Yeah,
Tosa
yeah, but
says
hold on,
is,
hold on. If a guy says he's a gambler, he can't be a
yeah.
witness at a wedding. We don't say, right? If someone's a gambler, they're not kosher for eight. So
So
what? We
right. I
shouldn't
mean, we
believe him.
believe the guy and why
Yeah.
we. But if you
We
wanted
shouldn't
to
believe him. What? I'm sorry.
if you wanted to formally stamp him as possibly Eidos, let's say he said, "Oh, I was just joking," you know. So you would in an Matzma Russia. That's what we say in an Matzma Russia. Although gambling is a psul drabanan, so it's a little bit trickier. But um, getting getting back to it. So, but what Tosa says is very profound. Tosa says, "Listen, if you were just talking about the incrimination, we'd say that self-incrimination doesn't work. But here, you're going to force the guy to bring a korban chatos and force him to do another avera. He ate chaylev. He's claiming it's bemazed. There's a consequence to that. In addition, it's not just how much of a rasha he is. If he's right, he can't bring the korban, because if he were to bring the korban, there's a down. He's in violation of chulam bazara. If the korban was either an obligation or there's a safety net, namely, okay, he's not obligated, so bring another korban. If it was like a korban ola, which you could bring as a nadava, that would be one thing. But you can't bring a korban chatos as a nedava, right? Or as a neder. You can only bring a korban chatos if you are in violation of a mitzvah b'shogeg, a certain kind of mitzvah. That's what the Torah says. So you're gonna say, oh, we're gonna stand on ceremony and say we don't believe his self-incrimination, and therefore we're gonna force him. He's screaming and yelling, "I want to do tshuva. I want to be a good Jew from now on." But in fact, 2 weeks ago when you saw me eating the chalev, it was bemazed. So I can't bring a korban. How could you believe him that he's bemazed? Therefore, you should bring a korban. That would be forcing him to do another avera. He wants to do tshuva. You're going to force him to do an Aveira. So there we don't say the rule of Ein and Mesamatz Marash. That's what Tosa says.
We
Okay?
give credit to a man that says Moda b'miktzah,
Yeah.
but we don't give credit to a person that admits his guilt, even though he did it intentionally. We don't
Well,
give.
again, we do give credit. We believe him when he says, the Gemara says, Ma'im Yirtzalom or Mezid Hayisi. Meaning, if he does say Mezid Hayisi, we believe him. What do you mean we don't give credit?
Well, we accept the person that says Moda b'miktzah, that is in the
Right?
case of Moda b'miktzah, that he could have said
Well,
Patur
we don't, but we
Ma'amol.
might have. We
Yeah.
don't, actually, but we don't say Migudi Bayamar Kofra Kol Nama Nama makes us. But the reason we don't say it is because it's too brazen. Ain't it Ameas Panabifne Bachova?
And so
But either way, you're right. There is a broad connection between those two things, but they're different enough that
you
it's
apply
not.
the rule of Migul.
Yeah, them saying Migu is one thing. This is a little bit different. There's a rule, that we don't accept self-incrimination. But the point is two things. Number one, self-incrimination is not accepted to formalize, one's status, to make one posiliados. That's point number one. Doesn't mean that we don't believe him. It just means that we don't we don't we don't recognize formal consequences, to what he's saying. That's number one. And number two is that's point number one. Point number two is if a person wants to do tshuva or he wants to be prevented from doing a further avera, then that's an exception. That's not called self-incrimination that we reject. That's called we respect the fact and we accept the fact that this individual, right, is now trying to distance himself from any kind of transgression. If the only way he can distance himself is to admit the truth, as he claims it is, that he, previously was a bigger villain than we thought, then so be it. That's not called self-incrimination. Self-incrimination, the rejection of self-incrimination is there to protect him. It's not there to, punish him further. Imagine if we were to say, we don't accept your self-incriminatory statement, and therefore bring the korban, even though you claim it's cool, even though from your point of view you're screaming and yelling, it's cool and bazar. I don't want to do another avera. That would be unacceptable. So this is these questions are good questions. They're all questions that were anticipated by the Rishonim and that pushed them to impose very strict parameters, like when do we apply these principles? Like when do we apply migu? And when do we apply the rule of Ein Adam Mesim Atzmo Rasha, that there's no self-incrimination in Jewish law? When do we apply these rules? The answer is we look at the case history, the evidence, and we look for patterns and explanations, and that's how we come to conclusions about what the principles are. That's what we're trying to do here, actually. So this is a discussion. So the Gemara says, Hodos Baldin Kamedim is also Machayev, and therefore that can't be the basis of Rabbi. So then the Gemara says something even more remarkable. We'll break these down later, but I just want to get to a place where we can go back. So the Gemara says, my mamon knas. What we meant is that you cannot be modeh, your admission when it comes to a knas doesn't work. What is a knas? Knas means penalty, as you know, but it means very specific type of penalties. For example, the Torah says that if you steal, not rob, but steal, gneva, right? So if you break into someone's home, and stealthily steal his object, so in addition to paying the Karen, the principal, the amount of the object that you have to return, the object that you took, and if it's destroyed, you have to pay the value of it. But in addition to that, there's also something called tashlume kefel. You have to pay, a double as a penalty. Tavachumachar, in some cases, if you slaughter the animal, you sell the animal, if it's an animal that you stole, you pay 4 or 5 times the amount. If you were to, to poke out the tooth or the eye of your eved, of your slave, they're yotze. Okay, these are all knossos in the Torah. So what we're saying is, moda b'knas is potter. If a person admits that he stole into someone's house stealthily and he stole money, he would pay the Karen, but he wouldn't pay the kefel. So the Gemara is saying, but if there were Edom against him,
unless he sees the witnesses coming.
What?
Unless he sees the witnesses coming.
Well, that's called, that's a discussion in the Gemara. Ra memash meshinu bayin. That's true. He can be very clever, so we don't want to give him that. Yeah, but that's the din that moda b'knas is patur, and it's based on a limud. Torah says, Asher Yarshiun Elohim, Parshas Mishpatim. It says, Asher Yarshiun Elohim. Elohim means, usually means Shem Hashem. Here it means the Dayanim. It means human Dayanim. So the drasha is, Asher Yarshiun Elohim, V'lo Marshias Atzmo. That, he has to be found guilty by the judge when it comes to knas, penalties, and not by self-admission. So the Gemara says, you see from there, which is stronger, Edom or Piv? Edom.
Edom.
Because Piv doesn't work for Knas, and Edom does work for Knas. So that's what the Gemara says. Ma Piv she mechayvo Knas, mechayvo Shvua, Edom she mechayvo noso Knas, Edom din she mechayvo noso Shvua. Okay. So then the Gemara says, this is where we get into the maze. The Gemara says, Mala Piv sheken mechayvo Karban, Tomar be'edim she mechayvo noso Karban. The Gemara says like this. Let's say an individual came to court and he said, I hereby admit that I ate chelev b'shogeg, before we're talking about b'mezid. Let's say, so I ate chelev b'shogeg, meaning inadvertently, accidentally. But chelev is something that triggers a korban if it's done b'shogeg. So will he bring a korban based on his admission? Sure. That's exactly what the Torah says. O hoda elav chataso, right? Or b'hisvadeh. 1 second. What is this? Hold on 1 second. My computer is giving me a signal. Okay, 1 second. Impossible. I don't know what it wants. Hold on 1 second. I seem to have lost everybody, but okay, now I'm back. Um, yeah. So this is the din of a korban. But let's say, for example, Adam were to come and they were to say it to this individual, we saw you eating chalev. This is what we were talking about before, the shogeg or whatever. And he responded and he said, I didn't, it's not true. I didn't eat chalev. What would happen in that case? So that's a machlokas Rabbi and the Chachamim. The Gemara says as follows. The Gemara is trying to ask a pircha on the Kal V'chomer. So the Gemara says, Mala piv shekain b'chayvo korban. If a man admits that he ate chalev b'shogeg, he brings a korban. Tomar be'edim she'ein b'chayvin also korban. But if Adam come to court and he contradicts them, they say he ate chalev b'shogeg, and he says, I didn't. We don't force him to bring a korban, according
How
to
can
the...
Adam ever know that he ate b'shogeg?
I'm sorry?
What his mindset
That's a
is.
great question. So let's hold off on that for a moment. But that is a very important question, especially for some Rishonim. So the Gemara says, Holo kasha. Rab Chia ki Rab Meir Svirale. Rab Chia, the author of this din of Rab Chia Kemaiso, is using this Kal V'chomer. He doesn't hold like the Chachamim. The Chachamim are the opinion that when it comes to a korban, piv is more powerful than edim. He holds like Rabbi Meir. What does Rabbi Meir say? Da Amar edim mechayven also korban mikal v'chomer. Rabbi Meir himself says if Adam come to court and they say that you ate chalev b'shogeg, even if he denies it, we're going to believe the Adam. Ditznan. This is a Mishnah in Masachet Krisos. Omer lo shnayim achalta chalev. If two witnesses come to the person, an individual or court or whatever, and they say, we saw you eating chalev. Vihu Omer, he responds and says, Lo achalti. He says, I did not. It's his word against two Adam. Normally we go by the Adam, right? 1 second.
But both could be true. He could possibly not have known, but the Adam knew.
Well, he's claiming that he knows that he didn't. So the Gemara says, Rab Meir mechayev, the Chachamim potrim. Rab Meir says we go by the Adam because Adam are stronger than Piv. The Chachamim, they disagree, as we said before. They think when it comes to korban, because the Torah says, O hoda elav chataso.
Yeah, but the pib only works against him, not to defend himself. Nobody would say that a person who denies what Adam said should be stronger than the Adam.
So this is
the person wants to incriminate himself, he's as strong as the Adam. That's something we could understand. But the idea that Adam come and say
right. So this is you're technically right, Medina de Gemara, but this is where the Balei Tosis and the Ramban and others come in, and they say no, we're talking about a case here. I mean, we are talking about a case here where the Adam say achalta chalev and he says lo achalti.
You always have a case where Adam come and
right
against the guy,
and we never care what he says.
Yeah,
but the difference is, look at Rashi for a moment. Omer lo shnayim achalta chalev shogeg.
Yeah.
V'hu omer lo achalti patur. Shehaya yachal lomar. This is where we get into it. Mezid hayisi v'patur min hakarban. Af kishomer lo achalti patur.
That's not a good comment. The guy doesn't want to make himself into be a Russia. What kind of ego is that?
It's a questionable ego as a Rishonim.
I mean, the guy is going to be ostracized in his community. He won't get shlishi anymore.
Right. But so Rashi puts it as a migu. It really comes from the Gemara in Krisos. The way I think it's a better way to interpret it is he has the ability to get himself out of this korban by saying
very expensive.
And therefore, when it comes to this korban, he's the boss. He's in charge. They don't mean it as a real migu, like, oh, we believe him.
Because it's a very serious consequence.
You know what it is? It's more like when we talked about the two types of migus, right? There's a migu of birur.
Not only that, this falls into what you just said before, but any other man says, Russia, the person doesn't make himself. This is the
right, but remember, that's what Tosa says. It doesn't apply here because you're not going to force him to be ma'ayil chulam bazara.
Mhm.
right? But what it comes under the rubric of we spoke about 2 weeks ago, which is, even in the world of migu, and I think this is the kind of migu that Rashi means here. There are two types of migus. There's a migu which just establishes your personal credibility. In other words, I have a better lie. I have an alternative taina, an alternative claim. It's preferable, meaning it gets me more.
Oh,
And if I don't use that, then that shows I'm an honest man, and you should believe me in what I say. If that were the case, and if it's against Adam, that's very hard to accept because it's called what we call migu b'makom anansadi or migu b'makom Adam. Normally, we don't say that. However, I think what's going on here is we're saying comes into the tchum of korban. What we're saying is the individual is king because the Torah says, "Oh hoda elov chataso." It leaves it makes it contingent upon his awareness, not only in addition to whether he did it or not. There's also the question whether he's acknowledging and he's aware or even admitting that he did it. That's where the extra words of hoda of chataso is. So what the Gemara is saying is, my mir salomar, right? Nezed hayisi. If he wants, he could get out of this. And therefore, even if we don't believe him that he was mazed, it's just a way of highlighting that in this area, he's king. Now, part of the reason he's king in Chatas and that it depends on a hodel of Chataso, Jacob will tell you, Jacob Gold that is because this is a matter of kapara. And therefore, it's more his personal domain than it is anybody else's business. That is the view of the Ramban. Others don't see it that way, but that's how the Ramban says. Anyway, if you go back to the Gemara says, Rabbi Meir disagrees. Rabbi Meir says if our two Adam would say that he is in violation and should bring a korban, and he says, I didn't do it, then we're going to listen to the Adam like we do in Kol Torah Kula. What troubled you is how come the Chachamim disagree? But Rabbi Meir is good, right? Rabbi Meir, chamura, look at the way he says it. Two Adam can bring you to the death penalty.
yeah.
Right? Nothing, proves the gold standard of Edus more than that.
Wrong argument.
Right? So lo yavieu lidei korban akal. All of a sudden it comes to bring a korban, we don't believe them. We believe them to get him to the gallows, but not to bring a korban. Amrulo, that's where the Gemara gets. So they said to him, meaning the Rabbanan, who said that when it comes to korban, Piv is superior to Edim. Their response to this was, "My mirtzalomer mezid ayisa yipater." He has an out clause. If he doesn't want to bring the korban, he can always say, "I was mezid." Ah, you're right. There's a downside. He's mezid matzma a little bit. True. But I think what they're trying to convey with all this is he's the bailim when it comes to the kapara and the havas korban, according to the chachamim. Then the Gemara says the same thing. Okay, we'll catch our breath after this. Elamala pivshikein b'chayva asham. The Gemara had a havamina to distinguish between chatos and asham. This is very fascinating too. The Gemara said, okay, fine. When it comes to chatos, maybe according to Rabbi Meir, Edim are superior to Piv. But is that true even when it comes to asham? What's the difference? Because in asham, Ramban explains it better, but in asham, the Torah uses the expression not just ohoda elav chataso, which means
Totally?
what?
Is Nasham totally we're talking about?
No, any asham. I'll explain in a minute. But the Gemara uses the expression when it comes to the asham, not just the expression it uses with the chatas, ohoda elav chataso, but vihisvada, a prerequisite, a precondition for him being obligated in the asham is the fact that he has to vihisvada, he has to confess.
There has to be an awareness.
So let's say not only an awareness, but an admission. Awareness means objectively, if we knew that he knew, maybe that, however, it's hard to know how to know that, but, that would be enough. Vihisvada seems to say that he has to take responsibility. He has to admit it. It sounds like when it comes to the world of karbanos, in other words, chatos and vahoda, and asham even more so, v'hisvada, in addition to doing the ma'isa avera, doing the action which triggers the chi of carbon, there's an added element, and that is the way that you personally relate to your own action. It's a fascinating idea.
There's no vidui by achatas?
There is, but the Torah doesn't say the word v'hisvada, and therefore it doesn't seem like it's a. There is vidui. If you look at the Rambam in Hilchos Ma'aser Karbanos, it's a very good question. The Rambam says there's vidui for chatas, there's vidui for asham, there's vidui for ola.
Practically comes to the same thing.
Yes, but since the Torah doesn't say v'hisvada in chatas and it does in asham, there are two different issues. One is when you bring this karbanos, do you also engage in the act of vidui? And the answer is yes. With according to the Rambam, the exception is shlamim, because shlamim is not that kind of a korban. Probably Pesach also. It's not that kind of a korban. It's not bala kapara. But when it comes to chatas, asham, ola, the answer is yes. But since why did the Torah use the expression v'hizvada and instead of vahoda, and why is it use the expression of even vahoda when it came to chatas? The answer is to tell you something additional, not just that if you bring a korban or when you bring a korban you should do vidui, but that the self-aware, the self-admission is a prerequisite for the chiyuv. Like there's no point in bringing an asham if you're not going to admit that you were wrong.
So no one can trump the person because he's the only one that can meet that criteria.
Well, that's what I'm the view that we talked about before, which is kaparas between you and the Rabbanu Shalom, which Jacob.
No, but the point here is that the Asham is elevated above Adam because he has a trump card. He's the only one who can be his father. So no one can be.
It's not just that he's the only one, but it's also that he's not chayiv a korban. With Ramban puts it,
until
he's
that
not chayiv a korban until he's willing to admit it. You want to say it in a kapara kind of way. You could say we're not going to give him the kapara unless he's mitzvada. It could go either way. It doesn't really matter. But at the end of the day, the vidui is a prerequisite for the bringing of the korban. That's a remarkable idea. So actually, what's so fascinating is
violence of the person, that he's the balabas over the situation.
Yeah. I'm saying Ramban goes, as I say, so far as to say, in the example that he brings, that the din of mimashkinan and lo mimashkinan, we say when it comes to a chatas and an asham, lo min mashkinan. Min mashkinan means like from the word mashkon, like we don't force him, we don't pressure him. It's time to bring the korban already. Why not? I mean, we do for shlamim, we do for an ola. So again, while Rashi and Tosas in different places say, no, because we don't need to pressure him. It's in his best interest. He's going to want to do it anyway. Why should we pressure him in something that's in his best interest, which he's going to want to do? But the Ramban's going a giant step further. The Ramban's saying, forget want to do. Forget about the want to do or in his best interest. It's just a personal kaparas between him and the Rabbanu Shalom. He doesn't want to. He's obligated to do it. He doesn't want to get. He doesn't want to do it. He wants to shoot himself in the foot. Let him shoot himself in the foot. Is he still obligated? Yes, but he's not. What we're saying in the case of Asham is until he's ready to publicly own up to what he did, there's no chi of korban even. It's a very remarkable idea. Because normally we think of korbanos.
There's no idea that the klal itself needs him to be cleansed of this avera.
The tzibur?
Yeah.
Well, these are individual. It's a very nice ha'ara, actually. Meaning, you're saying these are korbanos yachid.
In other words, he's doing damage to the corporal entity.
No, I hear what you're saying. You're saying a very nice idea, which is even though these are korbanos yachid, on another level, whatever yachid does,
if you looked at a graphic of the Jewish people, you'd see black spots all over for people who did these.
Right. No, it's a beautiful idea.
And the korban erases the black spots. So
it's a very nice idea. It's very appealing. It's not legally
binding. What happened?
We lost him?
Yeah, we lost him.
Hopefully he'll come back.
Huh?
Mir Shem will come back. Next week's in person, Andy. Are you here?
I'm sorry?
Next week we're doing in person. Are you
Yeah,
here next Tuesday?
next week I'm back in Mirza Hashem Monday to New York.
Okay, so after tomorrow, next week.
Mirza Hashem, yeah. Guess
I,
it's computer.
I assume the carbon doesn't work if you're not sincere also, like Yom Kippur.
Actually, the Ramban was quoting your comment about the Kapora. Or you were quoting the Ramban's comment, historically.
You bring a korban without vidui?
I'm back.
Good question.
Yeah, for some reason they when you have a school's computer, they do all sorts of crazy things all the time, and they.
Okay. Rabbi, when you bring the korban, it has to be sincere, like Yom Kippur, right? If you bring a korban and then you do the Aver again, you do it again and again and again, does it work? I assume it's like Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur only works if you're sincere,
No,
right?
Yom Kippur is a little bit of a different thing. No, what we say about Yom Kippur is that the Itzumo Shel Yom, that the power of the day itself
Is kapara, right?
doesn't
No.
work for people who
I
are
think
cynical
Jacob's
about it.
referring to what the Mishnah says when the guy says Echta Vashuv.
Yeah, exactly.
Doesn't work.
Echtav Yashuv or Echtav Yom Kippur Mechaper, to be more precise. That's
Right.
a Mishnah in the end of Yuma, that Ein Yom Kippur Mechaper, and then also Rebbe and the Chachamim, they were in Shua Safid Beis, and also Rebbe in the end of Masechet Yoma. Like if you're Boet, the Yom Kippurim, like you don't believe in Yom Kippur, you make fun of Yom Kippur, Chalila, so then Yom Kippur doesn't work for you either, which is only fair. But here we're talking about something a little different. But we're saying each Avera, let's say a Chatas, each Avera gets a different Chatas. However, what we're saying is the Chiv Chatas, part of it depends on admitting. I think it's a very, the way the Ramban puts it, it's exactly what I'm saying. I just think it's a very fascinating and very inspiring idea in a way. Meaning the kapara requires that you own up to what you did. It's not like a mechanical obligation only. Anyways, so what's fascinating is that the Gemara here thought that you should distinguish between Asham and Chatas. The Gemara thought that Chatas, maybe the Edom can impose, but maybe not Asham. So I don't want to get into Asham and Chatas right now, except to say that Chatas is more what I call Maisa Vera oriented. Right? The Gemara says in Zvachim that every individual, you can't bundle chatos together. Like, let's say you did a bunch of chatos, you can't bring a single korban for a bunch of chatos. Each chet, each Maisa Vera requires its own chatos. But the Gemara's mistapek about Ola, for example, maybe you could bundle a bunch of mitzvahs haseh under a single Ola. And some Rishonim think that same safek may apply to Asham. Meaning Asham is a little different than Chatos. It overlaps with Chatos, but it has a lot of Ola in it too, to be clear about it. Anyway, what does the Gemara say about this? So the Gemara says, says the Gemara, Asham and a korban, whatever we said, it's not true. The Gemara thought that even Rab Meir would agree that when it comes to an Asham, you have to own up to it. And therefore the Piv is stronger than the Eidos. Says the Gemara, no, it's the same thing as Chatos with regard to this. Then the Gemara thought, oh, what about a Chomesh? Sometimes in like Shuas Apikadon, whatever. So it's an Asham. And there's also, if you continue, you can also bring in a Chomesh. You have to add a fifth to the.
That's a Knas. That's a Knas, though.
Yeah. So the Gemara, Elamala Piv Shekin B'chayvo Chomesh. The Gemara says, "Lo kasher b'chia krab meir sfira like ki hechenim chayiv like parban mitav v'chomer b'chayiv chomish mitav v'chomer as well." Anyway, this is Rabbi. So what I want to add, we don't have so much time left, is the following. There's a very interesting this idea of Rabbi that you can replace piv, meaning hodas baldin, can be replaced by edim. and that Adam is superior, and therefore whatever Piv works, Adam works. This idea, how far do we go with it? So if you look in our Marmakomos for a minute, there's a very interesting discussion in the Rambam in Hilchos Gezeit. This is on page, I think it's on page 5. Does that make sense? Go to page 5 and look at Hilchos Gezela, Perek Dalid, Halacha Tes Vav and Tes Zayin. Does everybody have that?
Page?
You say
I think
page
page
5. 5. Chidush Harashba? No.
Yeah. You have Shuta Rajba?
Chidush
Right.
Harashba, Mesechted Daf Gimel Amid Aleph?
No. I'm
No.
looking for Rambam Hilchos Gezela. It's above the Rajba. There's Shelo to Tshuvo Tarajba, Chelik Beis Simin Reshvav, and on top of that are 2 Rambams. Everybody have that?
Tshuva Min Hadome?
No.
Aneni Modu Mikol Klal, Mikach Klal?
That's in the Chuvas Harajba. But before the Chuvas Harajba, you see something that says Halacha Tezayin, and then on top of it, Rambam Hilchos Gzela, Rambam Gzela Vaveda Halacha Tesvav.
Yeah.
Previous. What page is that?
Kotaf Mimenu Zehuvim?
Yes. Kotaf Mimenu Zehuvim. Correct.
Yeah.
Everybody have that? Or everybody who's looking for it has it?
It's on page 4, I think.
Page 4?
Oh, page 4? Okay.
Rambam Mesechted.
At the
So
bottom
let
of
me
the
explain.
page.
Rambam To'en V'Nitan.
No, not Toin V'Nitan, the one Gzela Vaveda. Right after Toin V'Nitan. We also have Toin V'Nitan, but right after that is Gzela Vaveda.
Rambam, I have it.
Okay, great. So this is just a little background. This is the famous case that we discussed earlier in the year and other times called Naska de Rababa. Right? Naska de Rababa is more famous than Brown versus Board of Education. It's like the Rambam always refers to it. He says, "Remember that famous case in the Talmud with the Naska?" So this is an expansion of that idea. The idea of Naska de Rababa is that Chataf Mimenu Zehuvin Bifnei Echad. The Rambam repeats this, and he talks about this case in Hilchos Mal V'Velove, in Hilchos Toin V'Nitan, here in Hilchos Gzela Vaveda. It is a landmark case. And the Rambam found much in it that is intriguing beyond the case, as we'll see. So, Chataf Mimenu Zehuvim Bifnei Echad. Let's say Ruvain, right, accuses Shimon. I'll say differently. Shimon grabs Ruvain's object, let's say watch for a moment, say instead of, gold bars or whatever, it's easier. Shimon grabbed Ruvain's watch in the presence of an Eid Echad, a single aid. Chataf mimenu zehuvim b'fnei Eid Echad. What's his claim? Why did he do that? Well, Ruvain, who was previously wearing the watch, says because he's a thief, and he should give me back the object that he stole. Shimon says, "I'm not a thief. Hu omer shali chatafti. I'm simply reasserting ownership of what is mine. I'm taking back my own object. The esrim hayu, and it was worth $20. Even if the single witness who witnesses this doesn't know how much the value was. So this is the principle of Naska Rababa, which is that if there had been 2 witnesses here, we would have considered the claim of in chatfi v'didi chatfi, I'm simply grabbing back that which is already mine, we would say, well, what we saw, we know what we saw. We saw that the other fellow had a mukzakos, a tfisa. He was the status quo anti-owner. And this guy grabbed it from him. He's claiming it's his, and the other guy's claiming it's a theft. So the Edom are, what the Edom don't know, but the combination of the chazaka or the rove, whatever you want to call it, and well, in this case, it's also mukzak, and the combination of the chazaka and the edus would win the case. If there's only an eid achad, you can't win the case because you need more than one witness, right? But what you can do is impose a shvua, but he can't take the shvua. Because to take the shvua would require, let's say, according to the Rambam, that he say to the eid achad, you're lying. The eid achad isn't lying. The eid achad doesn't even know what happened. He just know what he saw. All he saw was that Shimon grabbed Ruvain, a watch that Ruvain had been wearing. He has no knowledge whether Ruvain's claim of previous ownership or Shimon's claim of previous ownership is correct. Therefore, it's mechuyev shvua. Because in order to be nishba, he has to be able to say the eid achad is a liar, and he can't say that in good conscience. So
Sure is not that I'm not a thief. The sure would have to be that I didn't take it from Reuven.
That's the only shvua we would accept, but he can't make that
shvua. If he could swear that he's not a thief, he would be able to swear that.
Meaning I don't want to get into this now because we've done it in the past, but it's a very big chiddush, this din of Naskir Rabba, the way that the Rambam understands it, and not just the Rambam in this case. The Rambam, the Rimigash, Rashi, the Rajbam, just not the Balitosis. They understood it differently, but it's a big chiddush that you have to take a shvua that denies the credibility of the eid achad rather than just being mevarer, just clarifying, right?
To say that it's mine. In other words, you should be
able
to say that
Why can't you go to court and say, I take a shvua d'oraisa? It's true what he saw is true. It's not his fault. He's not lying. Just the implications of what he's saying are not correct. The implications are wrong. It's mine. We don't allow that. So that's a din of Mitol Sheni Chol Sham Shal. What does that have to? That's the old din of Naskir Rabba. What does that have to do with us? Why am I telling you this now? Because that's the background to halacha tezayin. Look at the next halacha. Amar Achotev. Let's say Shimon, who grabbed the object, right, who claims it's his, but is going to end up paying for it because there's only an eid achad and so on. So let's say he said Esrim Chatafti, Esrim Shalihain, Vanigzalomer Mea Chataf. Let's say he says the object that I grabbed, which is mine, the watch, is a $20 watch. And the Nigzal said, what are you talking about? You grabbed 2 watches. Right? Hoel ve'ein ha'ed yodea minyanan. And the Edom don't know. They just saw, they were standing at a distance. They don't know how valuable or how many objects were stolen. So this is tricky. Now, this is not the classical Naskir Rabba. Classical Naskir Rabba is simply that in Chatvi v'didi Chatvi. Here it's in Chatvi, right? And it wasn't worth the amount that you claim it is. It's an additional point. So what happens now? So the Rambam says, Hare mishalem ha'esrim shahoda bahan. The 20 that he admits is worth, he has to pay based on mitol sheni chalishav mishalem shakvatfan. But then he says, B'nishba shvuas haTorah al hashar sharin eschai b'miktsas. So this is a quotation from the Gaonim. The Rambam says, because there's a discrepancy also in the price, so he's only going to pay the lower price, but he's going to have to take a shvua d'oraisa on the rest because it's like Reb Chia. What did Reb Chia say? Even if there's no moda b'miktsas, if there's edim b'miktsas or chiyuv b'miktsas, that's the equivalent of moda b'miktsas and yechai b'shvua. So what happens here? The din of mito sheni chalishav b'shalim, because he can't take the shvua to contradict the other aid, that obligation, which turns into money, but it only turns into money, a partial payment of the claim. The claim is for $100. Because of Mitoshen and Chalishav and Mishalem, the fellow is going to end up paying $20. But the Gaonim say, yeah, that's fine, but he should take a shvu on the rest because miktsas tashlumin is Reb Chia, and Reb Chia says motive miktsas. Says the Rambam, no. The dati no tebazeh sheishava heses sharei lo hoda beklum el amar shali chatafti. Ram says ad kan. Ram says, listen, I'm a huge advocate of this Supreme Court case of Naskin Rababa. And he does, by the way, expand it considerably from the case of the Gemara. If you look at other cases of the Rambam, especially Perik Daled, Chos Halacha Ches, and Perik Yud Daled, Hilchos Malva Velova, the Rambam has a significant expansion based on how he explained it of Naskin Rababa. But the Rambam says, I'm willing to expand Naskin Rababa, but I'm not willing to expand Reb Chia. Again, what did Reb Chia say? That even if Moda B'Miktsas, if having to pay part because of Hodas Baldin K'Medim Dami is sufficient to trigger Chiyuv Shvua on the rest, the same is true if Edom are made on Miktsas, that you have to take a Shvua on the rest. But what if it's not Edim, plural? What if it's only Eid Echad who makes you chayiv tashlumin b'miktsas because of mitol shenichol l'shavam mishalem? Will you still say the din of Rabbi Chia? So that's a debate between the Gaonim and the Rambam. The Gaonim say, we don't care how many witnesses there are. What we care about is that a claim of $100, a part of that claim is being paid out. We don't care why. Because of two witnesses, because of one witness, because of one witness indirectly because he can't take a shvua, it doesn't make a difference. As long as part of the whole claim is being paid, there should be enough to trigger a chiyuv shvua on the rest. That is the view of the Gaonim. And the Rambam says, no, the din of Reb Chia is a chiddush to begin with. After all, the Torah's motive mixas, Asher Yomar Ki Huzeh, is literally motive mixas, where the guy himself admits that he owes part of the money. So Reb Chia came along and he said, you know what? Shalotahei hadas piv. I'm sorry. Yeah. Gedola mehadas edim. Meaning, personal admission can never be superior. It can never be more formidable, right, than two witnesses. So it's good for one. What one achieves, the other achieves. That's fine in the paradigm case of Reb Chia when you're talking about two witnesses. But just because of the din and that Eid Echad mitol shenichol l'shavam mishalem, that an Eid Echad's single witness testimony can end up converting the Chiyuv Shvua into a Chiyuv Mamon. So what happens if it converts a Chiyuv Shvua into a Chiyuv Mamon b'miktsas? Will that trigger a motive b'miktsas? Says the Rambam, no. That far we don't go. Very interesting case. So there are other cases like this as well. We're going to have to stop here. Just let me say it this way. The Shulchan Aruch and Siman Pei Zayin and Siman Ayin Hey, but especially Siman Pei Zayin, is the locus class. This is where this is fought out. Like, what are the parameters of Reb Chia? It's just a very interesting phenomenon. Reb Chia expanded motive b'miktsas, and then the Rishonim debated how much can you expand on the classical Reb Chia? What is the principle? Is it tashlumin b'miktsas? Is it edim being no less than Eid Echad? What's the rule? That will dictate all sorts of cases. So if you look at Shulchan Aruch, Siman Pei Zayin, and you look at the Sma and the Shach and the Taz, and in other places, this becomes a very lively argument. For example, let's say a person, in denying something, ends up admitting it unwittingly, like he doesn't know the law well. So when he responds to the Baldavar, he doesn't intend to admit anything, but by virtue of what he says, the Dayanim are going to say, "Aha, he has to pay mixas." That's not through Edim, and not even through Hueid Echad and Mitol Shenichol L'Shavam Mishalem. it's mitoch tanaso or tviaso of the Baldavar himself. He ends up unintentionally not owning a chiyuv miktsas, but by virtue of what he says in defending himself or in explaining the situation, he ends up triggering a chiyuv miktsas. Is that Reb Chia? Or let's say the Dayanim themselves, through their legal acumen, not something that's obvious that he trips himself up. Let's say their own legal acumen, they end up realizing there should be a chiyuv tashlumin b'miktsas. Is a chiyuv tashlumin b'miktsas al yidei hadayanim? Is that the equivalent of Reb Chia? So these are all debates. There's an interesting Rambam in Perek Chabeis, Silchos Eidos Halacha Beis, also where the Ravid says, I'm not so sure that this is a case of Reb Chia. So it's a very fascinating phenomenon that you have a din Torah from based on the pasuk Asher Yomar Ki Huzeh, Moed B'Miktsas is Chayiv, that differentiates it from Kofar Kol. Then you have Reb Chia who came along, and there's controversy already in the Gemara, and then the Psak, and then to understand the case of Reb Chia, and then a whole literature in the Rishonim, and then later in the Poskim, about expanding even further 5-7 other cases where you have some dimensions of Reb Chia, and some split from others, where you can really, test in the halachic laboratory, like what is it about Reb Chia? What makes Reb Chia tick? You can isolate, some of the different, components to try to figure out, is that the equivalent of Moed B'Miktsas, yes or no? Very vibrant debates. Okay, we'll stop here next week, Amir Hashem. After Mariv, live, we'll
In
have
person.
Live and in person. We'll have a shir on Inyane
Pesach. Thank
and
you.
just to remind whoever is interested, Monday night at 8:00, either live in Yeshiva University in the Shank Shul, or they'll be sending out, I think, a Zoom
link
at 8:00. If people want to join, that'll be on the theme of Korban Pesach.
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Have a
you.
great week, everybody.
Yasher
Thank
koach.
you.
Yeah.